Well, good morning, everybody. My name is Connor Reiten. I am a co-chair of the Salem Chamber of Commerce Business Advocacy Committee and have the opportunity to guide us through a really good agenda this morning. I know we say this every month, but we have a jam-packed agenda that we look forward to. Talking about housing, and I think this is something that's going to have really significant impacts across the Oregon economy. When Governor Kotek was elected, we were really pleased to hear housing become a really significant priority for her administration. So we're going to get some updates on that, as well as some updates at the end on the beneficial ownership information. What is it, a program coming from the federal government? So we're pleased to have the state here as well to help us guide through that. So let's start off as we normally do with introductions. If we want to start over here, we'll finish back my way. That's good.
Good morning, Kevin Cruz with Cruz Northwest. Josh Day, First Commercial Real Estate.
TJ Sullivan, Hagen Hamilton.
Mike Karen, Business Industries.
Salem Chamber.
Brandon Blair, Summit Wealth Management.
Shane Matthews, on Star Brokers.
Good morning, Raquel Moore Green, RMG.
Dan Farrington, BBSI.
Phil Rickey, Mark Pools.
Katie Plastics, Salem Chamber. Corey Polito, Executive Chair, Kaiser Chamber. Drew Miles, Salem Hill.
Trevor Leahy, Oregon Secretary of State.
Jodi on behalf of Oregon Homebuilders Association.
Natalie Janney with Multitech Engineering.
Matthew Tschabold with the Governor's Office. And I'm glad you're last introduce yourself because you're first up this morning. We're really fortunate to have Matt Tschabold this morning. He is the Senior Housing Policy Advisor for Governor Kotek. And you're going to tell us a little bit more about that legislative priority. We have a time constraint this morning. I understand we have to get you out of here by 7:40.
Yeah.
So we're going to stick to that. If we have any time for questions before the 7:30 cutoff, we will do our best to get those in. Otherwise, we will have to move on quickly there. So we'll introduce Matt and get right to it. Great.
All right. Well, good morning, everybody. Thanks for letting me join you this morning. What I'd like to do is just talk a little bit about the governor's agenda around housing and homelessness. And I'm also happy to try and leave some time for questions at the end. Does that work for folks?
Yeah, absolutely.
Great. So when the governor was sworn into office, she issued 3 executive orders around housing and homelessness. Her housing and homelessness is one of her 3 initiative areas, which are the top priorities for her administration. Other than housing and homelessness, it's addressing the behavioral health crisis, as well as addressing early childhood literacy and readiness to learn. On the housing and homelessness agenda, on her first day in office, she issued 3 executive orders to help set the framework for her housing and homelessness agenda. The first was 2302, and 2302 established an emergency around unsheltered homelessness across the state. It established an enterprise-wide response across state government through an emergency management lens to address unsheltered homelessness, and signaled to the legislature her intent to ask for an early investment package. So a major appropriations bill prior to when normal appropriations bills would make it through the legislative process. The second executive order that she issued was EO 2303, which was internally focused, but it directed all state agencies to participate in an assessment of any programs and services that were addressing unsheltered homelessness or people experience non-unsheltered homelessness or people at risk of homelessness. And to then, through an assessment process, understand what the enterprise system was or lack of a system around addressing homelessness, and identify duplication in services, gaps in services, changes needed to programs or funding levels. And so we've been doing that process internally. So I think it's a little less publicly well known, but the driver of that will lead to an action plan beginning in 2024 around changes to various programs and services and the enterprise structure to better support addressing outcomes of reducing the number of people experiencing unsheltered homelessness, improving program and service outcomes, and improving an enterprise-wide system of service delivery to create more efficiencies and effectiveness with the programs that exist. And the third is Executive Order 2304, which established the Housing Production Advisory Council. So it noted that Oregon is currently short 140,000 housing units to address the housing need at affordability levels that Oregonians require, and outlined that we need an additional 440,000 units over the next 20 years in order to meet the projected need based on population trends and population growth that we anticipate. She also set an annual housing production target in that executive order of 36,000 units per year. And that what that target is meant to achieve is that within a 10-year period of time, it would address that deficit of 140,000 units, but then also make sure we were on track to meet the 20-year forecasted demand. So she then established the Housing Production Advisory Council. I assume Natalie is going to talk a bit about that, so I'm not going to go into great depths, but appointing 25 Oregonians to a council that work in either public housing, regulated affordable housing through nonprofits or other organizations, and then market rate housing to identify a set of recommendations by the end of the year on how actions the state could take to increase housing production in communities across Oregon. And I'll pause there because I know Natalie's going to talk about that a bit. As you know, so those set the framework for her agenda overall in her administration. She's been tackling it, I would say, in maybe 3-4 categories of time frames, and I'll kind of walk through each of those. First was an emergency response, an immediate emergency response. Oregon has experienced an increase in unsheltered homelessness of over 50% over a 4 to 5 year period of time. So she went to the legislature and asked for an early investment package in order to address the crisis and in an emergency response, emergency management fashion. We were grateful to the legislature because they partnered with the governor to appropriate $130 million in an early investment package. And the objectives of that were to stand up over 700 new shelter beds across the state. We house over 1,600 Oregonians experiencing unsheltered homelessness. And unsheltered homelessness is one of the most costly and most intensive issues to address. There's a number of people who are doubled up, maybe living with family, living with friends. Maybe they're living in an RV or a car, but unsheltered homelessness are the people we see struggling and suffering on the streets every day. So to rehouse at least 1,600 Oregonians experiencing unsheltered homelessness, and then to prevent homelessness through various rent assistance and emergency interventions, kind of the safety net you don't see, for over 9,000 Oregonians between January 10th, when she issued the executive order, and then January 10th of 2024. And so resources are out in communities right now. A lot of good people doing a lot of good work to get shelter beds established, to rehouse Oregonians experiencing homelessness and prevent homelessness for other folks. In Marion and Polk counties, which I hope many of you are involved in those local processes, but in Marion and Polk counties, what that translates to, you're coordinating on this. It's roughly 80 new shelter beds, around 180, a little over 180 Marion and Polk County residents rehoused, and then preventing homelessness for almost 700 residents of the two counties as well. I will maybe I'll talk about it in a second. So the second was more of a intermediate stage, or just post-emergency response stage, and that was making sure that we had an appropriate budget to address both homelessness and housing production. And working with the legislative leadership, she was able to get an unprecedented level of investment for housing production and homelessness at the state level. So over $1 billion to Oregon Housing Community Services to fund programs around homelessness prevention, affordable home ownership, and then by far the largest amount, which is close to $800 million, was funding gap financing programs for new affordable housing development. So this is new affordable units run by nonprofits and housing authorities around the state. It is permanent supportive housing units, so housing that actually has services on site, so that we can move people out of experiencing unsheltered homelessness into units that have services, as well as preservation. There's a lot of regulated affordable housing or public housing around the state that is near the end of its useful life or near the end of its affordability contracts. And so there's a body of resources to preserve that and maintain those units into the future. It's a very unprecedented level of investment. I think last biennium, the state appropriated maybe close to $400 or $500 million for gap financing for new affordable housing development. Over the course of the biennium, OHCS received $1 billion worth of requests from various profit and for-profit developers across the state. So we were confident that the agency and the system overall, right, that the development and service delivery system could handle close to $1 billion of funding. And so those resources are starting to move out of the agency and into communities to build and preserve new affordable housing. So that was kind of our second step of addressing the intermediate. And then we have an agenda around some long-term changes needed to address the crisis in Oregon. So one I mentioned earlier, which is really an assessment of what is our service delivery system around addressing homelessness and unsheltered homelessness in the state, and what does that need to look like moving forward. You know, for people who aren't in the weeds, the state has traditionally run homeownership, rental housing, homelessness programs through kind of an anti-poverty response for a long time, but never to the level of investment that exists today. And really what we are now doing is moving from what we would call a funding structure to actually a program and service delivery structure. And so that is, what is the state's role overall? What is the service delivery system? How are we making sure we're getting efficient outcomes for Oregonians, and then working in partnership with local communities. So that is a big piece of work. But what are the system changes we need around our homelessness response programs? The other major long-term system change that the governor has on her agenda is around housing production. At its root cause, the cause of homelessness is a lack of affordable housing, and Oregon has a significant deficit. And so she has been doing a lot of work, both advised by the Housing Production Advisory Council members, as well as engaging with cities, home builders, nonprofit organizations, communities around the state to understand what the housing production needs are in each community and what actions would help to address that. And she's building out a housing production agenda in order to take state actions either through executive branch authority or through the legislature to support increased housing production. It's fairly rare, I think, in the United States for a governor to take housing production as a statewide priority with direct funding and actions. But you know, the governor's heard it on her One Oregon tour from every county around the state. You know, the small businesses are having trouble recruiting staff and retaining staff, particularly in coastal and eastern Oregon communities, that people are struggling to be able to move from their first rental housing unit into a starter home. And the crisis is just really affecting a lot of Oregonians quite broadly. And so she's looking at what programs we need to have stood up. One body of that is the state has traditionally invested a lot of funds in low-income affordable housing. And we're starting to see some of the challenges that the market would face in delivering affordable housing at a 30% of the median income level, just because of required returns from capital equity, the equity and debt markets. We're starting to see that creep into moderate income housing development, where builders are having trouble getting financing and getting the returns they need to get projects funded. And so there's a big conversation at the state right now. What's the state's role in helping to finance moderate income housing development in order to boost supply across the state? And we also know that we're going to need changes around how the state has its land use system structured, the state's role in the entitlement process and the permitting process. And so she's building out an agenda around that and listening to builders and cities and local communities around what actions the state can take. Because that's part of her agenda. She will be coming into this short legislative session with a housing production proposal. It will have a number of changes to the state's existing system. It will have a number of programs to support increased housing production. Which I'm happy to kind of talk about that if folks want, but that is only a first step. And she's very committed to, beyond even the 2024 short session, continuing to take action to support increased housing production, because the headwinds are pretty strong. You know, maybe one of the worst inflation and interest rate environments since the 1980s for housing production. And so, despite that, we still need to make progress because every year we're not hitting our production targets. We know that the production crisis and the affordability crisis is only going to get worse, and that will drive the crisis for around people experiencing homelessness and displacement around the city. So that's just a general overview that I wanted to mention here this morning, and then maybe happy to take questions if folks have them about any of the specifics or anything I didn't talk about as well.
Just I'm an insurance agent. And one of the things we've done over the last decade is made it a lot easier to sue builders. As a result, when builders go to build tract homes or multifamily, their insurance rates go through the roof. Just as an example, Lone Mountain Construction, who built a home and hotel here in Salem, they've done a lot of affordable housing projects around the state. Their insurance just doubled from $150,000 a year to $300,000 a year, just because of their involvement in building affordable housing projects. I would say that one of the things we could do at the state level is try to look at some of the things we've done in the last 10 years to make it easier to sue builders and reduce some of those things so that they can build affordable housing projects without fear of getting class action lawsuits.
Yeah, thank you. A couple comments on that. I think it's a really good point. I think one, in the affordable housing space, I've worked in affordable housing for a long time. We have pushed the industry from being, I would say, exclusively or primarily an anti-poverty system around providing programs for low-income Oregonians or just residents of the United States to help address poverty and try and move people from poverty into economic stability. And as we've seen increased overlap between people needing access to those programs and affordable housing and some of the behavioral health issues that are going on, we've really kind of pushed this anti-poverty system into also a behavioral health or case management system. And that's putting a lot of stress on affordable housing nonprofits, right? They're building buildings where historically they would be housing people that are, have jobs, they're working, they just need some support with lower rents, given their life circumstances. And as we have put in requirements around a certain percentage of units have to be permanent supportive housing, you'll get services dollars and you're going to have case managers on site. What we're realizing is we haven't appropriately addressed some of the risk and insurance issues. So that's something we're working closely with Housing Oregon and the housing authorities of Oregon on to understand how the state can support what they are experiencing and their challenges in getting insurance and their challenges with risk on site as we're asking them to serve a higher needs population. So a comment on that one. I think the second comment is, the governor, when she was speaker, she was one of her legislative accomplishments was changing the overall land use system to increase production, requiring duplexes, triplexes, and quadplexes on most parcels across the state of Oregon. Our state land use laws around housing, around Goal 10, are really focused on how do we increase production, but also increase density. And I think a key piece of that and this, what you're getting at is condominium defect liability, statute of limitation, and statute of ultimate repose. And that's an issue. We know that we build less vertical homeownership units than the surrounding states. We know that there's many reasons for that, but part of that is the risk and cost associated with defect liability, the defect liability structure in Oregon. And if we are going to be, as a state, directing local governments and shaping the market to go vertical, it can't just be rental. It can't just be rental. We need to facilitate, call it what you want, townhouses, row houses, tract houses, going vertical and multifamily. And we need to, as we have changed the structure of our underlying zoned density, we also, from a primarily detached single family state to middle housing, mixed housing type state, there's a whole other set of state statutes we also need to change. I wouldn't just say around issues around risk and insurance, it's around the process that we go through with regard to land use entitlement, permitting, and public works, the process we go through around community and neighborhood involvement. a lot of those pieces are still structured, in a through a historic lens, and we need to make sure we're aligning those as well. Agree and appreciate the comment.
Looks like we have time for about one more. Anyone's got it?
Jump in. So $1 billion seems like a lot of money to invest in housing, but it will go faster than anybody expects, right? So what is the plan to ensure that the way that is spent is structurally changing the base reasons for houselessness?
Changing how it's the structural reasons for houselessness. I would say that it is a lot of money. It is going to go fast. I think what you're talking about are probably cost and other barriers to production when you're asking about changing the underlying reasons. Is that right?
Yeah, well, the money's going to be gone at some point. We don't know that a future legislature will have access to that much money to spend.
Mm-hmm.
And if they do, will they choose to fund this kind of thing at that level?
Yeah.
So understanding that the funding isn't, guaranteed for future years.
Yeah.
Wondering how the structure is of the disbursement of these funds so that it's well spent and makes the structural changes that you need.
Gotcha. I think that probably feeds into her production agenda overall, which is what does the state need to do to help facilitate increased housing production generally, right? In the United States, housing is primarily a market commodity. I mean, there's a segment of the market that's public housing. There's a segment that's financed through nonprofits as affordable housing, but it's still primarily a market commodity. So we need to make sure that the structure of the marketplace is set up to facilitate that, because it is a good that the public wants and needs in order to be able to just thrive and be stable in their lives. And so the production work that she's putting in place, her ask in the upcoming legislative session, her production agenda after that will be focused on, all right, what are the changes we need to existing state statutes, existing state rules, what supplemental programs can be put in place to help support the private marketplace in increasing their production over current levels. That's really the only way we're going to address the price. It's looking both at what we're financing in the affordable housing space and the changes to help facilitate increased production in the market. Okay, well, thank you for your time this morning. I really appreciate it.
Thank you. All right, thank you, Matt, for being here with us this morning. I know you have places to be, so yeah, you're welcome to stay with us as long as you can, but sounds good, just to go whenever you need to. Next, we have Natalie Janney. Natalie and I have the opportunity to serve together on the Marion Polk Homebuilders Association board, and so she does an outstanding job of representing us in a number of different arenas as the home building community. And in this case, she serves on the Housing Production Advisory Council that Matt had referenced earlier. Natalie is a civil engineer and a vice president in multi-tech engineering, and we've got about 15 minutes with her this morning, so we appreciate you being here, and we'll turn it back over to you.
Good morning, everyone. Thanks for having me. As mentioned, my name is Natalie Janney. I'm with Multi-Tech Engineering. For those of you who maybe aren't familiar with Multi-Tech Engineering, we're a local Salem-based engineering firm. And what we typically do is we take properties from their bare state through the land use process, through construction plan approval. We help monitor it during construction, and then we also do building design for apartments. So we help with that part too. So I just give that background to say that we're familiar with all parts of the housing production process, land use, design, and the building. And because of that, I feel like we have a unique opportunity to really see how these different parts of the process can impact a project as a whole. So we get to kind of see, the changes in land use, what that can mean or what the project ends up looking like ultimately. As a civil engineer, it's also really important that we don't do anything to compromise, fire life safety or risk to the public. So I just want to put that out there as the basis for none of the recommendations that we talk about on HPAC are things that would compromise fire life safety. That's been really important to us. So Matthew mentioned the Housing Production Advisory Council is a group of about 25 people in the housing space. There's about 4 of us on the council that do what would be considered more market rate, not really affordable housing. And when we started in March, we set out to kind of determine what the framework would be, what we'd be looking at, what were kind of an overview of the issues that we saw, and then how we wanted to kind of tackle them. So we ended up setting up 5 different work groups that we are each in. Most of us are in at least 2 work groups. So they are land availability, land development, permitting, codes and design, workforce shortages, and finance. I am the work group chair for codes and design, and I'm also on permitting work groups. Currently, I don't know the exact count because some more recommendations have been coming in, but I think we're at over 50 recommendations that have been submitted for full HVAC consideration. And kind of what that process looks like is at the work group level, we come up with different topics. We have what are called subject matter experts come in and speak to us about the different topics, and then we work from there to craft a recommendation. Once the work group has decided that the recommendation is complete and is ready for full consideration, then it's sent to the full HPAC where it goes through a 3-meeting process. The first meeting, we just read the recommendation and kind of ask general questions. The second meeting is where we do public testimony. And then the third meeting is the final discussion and consideration of whether or not to vote on it or maybe send it back to the work group for more work and things like that. So we've gone through this process on quite a few recommendations so far. We have quite a few left to do still this year. We're supposed to have our final framework document done by the end of this year. So we've got quite a few still to go through. I have my cheat sheet. I don't want to bore you and go through. I could go through all of them. Connor knows, he's had to listen to me talk about the specifics of them. Really what we kind of approached it as is there really is no silver bullet when it comes to increasing production in the state. Different communities have different issues, and there's a lot of little things that have happened kind of over time that have made housing harder and take longer to produce. And they're not without good reason. You know, they were put in place with the best of intentions. But it's just kind of, it's death by 1,000 paper cuts, right? So we're at that point now where it's just one more thing, one more thing, one more thing. And so we really wanted to look at what are some of those things that are really getting in the way and what can we do to kind of pull them back, like I said, without compromising things like fire life safety. So just to kind of, I can go through and give an overview of a few of them of what we're looking at. So we have 3 recommendations that talk about wetlands. So looking at how we deal with wetland banks in the state of Oregon, how we regulate wetlands that aren't jurisdictional from the federal government, and then different ways that we could mitigate non-federally jurisdictional wetlands. We have recommendations that have looked at things like the plan review process, things that we could do to maybe expedite and make that process more efficient. It's pretty common for the plan review process to take a year or more. This is like after you have your land use approval and you're just trying to get your construction documents approved. You know, it can be pretty common that you submit your plans, you get comments back, you think you address those comments, you submit again and you get a whole different set of comments back. So kind of looking at ways to streamline that process a little bit more. Looking at ways to get answers earlier on in your project so that you have some certainty that something that you want to do during land use that's going to impact your overall design isn't going to result in you having to go back for a modification later on. Certain things like putting in timeframes, statutory timeframes for things that currently don't have statutory timeframes. So for a lot of housing production, a lot of housing that we do in the state of Oregon, we have 120-day statutory timelines for when you need to have a decision. But there's certain things that don't, things like comp plan zone changes and annexations don't have any regulatory timeframe. So can we put a timeframe into those? There's certain cities in the state where it can take 2 years to get annexation approved, and other cities where it takes, you know, less than 6 months. So maybe trying to figure out if we can box that in a little bit. That one also talks about looking at our annexation process in general, ones that don't have to go to voters, because it's really kind of subjective and there really is no criteria and there's really no way to review it. So kind of looking at how we can change that. To your point about condos, we did a recommendation about condos and decreasing the statute of repose for liability. So currently in the state of Oregon, it's 10 years and taking that down to 6 years, which is more in line with how Washington, the timeframe that Washington has. We looked at a recommendation about offsite traffic mitigation. So what a project has to do in order to improve the traffic improvements that are not necessarily directly in the project, but next to it, because that process can be extremely time consuming. And it can be extremely expensive. It has this, I could nerd out about it as an engineer, but there's a lot of scope creep that happens in that process. And then once you get it approved and built, you get reimbursed for it, but you don't get the money back for years. And so it's just probably not the most efficient way. I mean, a lot of public infrastructure, especially when it comes to traffic, is funded by private development. And so kind of looking at ways to narrow that focus down and streamline that process. One of the things that takes the longest in construction plans is stormwater design. So the stormwater that you have to do in Salem is different than the stormwater you have to do in Kaiser. They don't have similar requirements and they don't have similar processes. So looking at ways that maybe we can make it more consistent and limit kind of what cities put in place, because currently DEQ doesn't give a lot of guidance about how stormwater standards have to be put in place. So kind of seeing if we can put some more guidance on that so that we have more consistency from one jurisdiction to the next. There's a recommendation about increasing accessibility and visitability, but making it maybe not necessarily a requirement, but more of an incentive so that builders will be able to do it without compromising how they do their designs in the first place. There's a recommendation about apprenticeship ratios. So this has been a massive learning process. I didn't know about a lot of this stuff until we started talking about it, but apparently Oregon has a 1-to-1 apprenticeship ratio for like electricians, and that's different than the surrounding states. Washington's is, I don't know, 4-to-1 or 6-to-1. Idaho has a much bigger ratio. So looking at, can we match our surrounding states for those things to help make it so that we can get more electricians certified in a quicker time frame. And then there's several financing ones. Financing's really not my area, so I'm not as well versed on those, but things like offsetting SDCs for affordable housing projects. There's ways for local governments to maybe take out a loan from the state to offset SDCs so that they can pay those back to developers sooner. Ways for states to get loans, or for cities to get loans from the state in order to implement infrastructure that's needed so that could support housing production growth. So that's kind of, I ran through that kind of quickly and kind of an overview. Some of it can get really into the weeds, and one of the legislators told me last week that he hasn't come to any of my work group meetings because they're boring, but in general, it's that kind of like in the weed things, those little, I mean, I hope you could see just from like the explanation that it's all these little things that have really kind of gotten in the way of being able to produce housing and to produce it quickly. I mean, housing in Oregon can take between 2 to 5 years, 2 years being on the quick side of things. And that's really changed in the last decade. I mean, it wasn't maybe even a decade ago where you could start your entitlement process in the fall and be ready to pull your construction permits in the spring. And that's really not, I'm looking at Margaret because, you know, that's really not how it is anymore. We're starting projects that aren't going to start until 2025. So just kind of looking at, from my perspective, we do mostly market rate housing. That's what our clients bring to us. But even in terms of affordable housing, if we can make it quicker, if we can shorten the amount of time that it takes for a project to get from beginning to having people move in, that's going to help production too. I mean, we can talk about money and infrastructure and all those things, but every year that we don't produce housing, we get further in the hole. So what can we do to shorten that time frame to get people into homes is kind of how that's been my priority on the Housing Production Advisory Council. From here, as Matthew said, we're going to come up with a framework document with all these recommendations, and then we kind of just, then it's up to the governor to decide what to do from there. Some of them she could do, with the executive branch. Some of them will require legislative action. We are on the council are really hopeful that this will really move the dial forward, but that's really not up to us at that point. I really hope that this hasn't just been an intellectual exercise. That's kind of been the fear all along, especially when I look at how much time I've spent on this. I was asked about a week ago how much time I had put into this, and I really didn't want to think about it, but then I did. And I have put in over 200 hours since March of meetings and time crafting the recommendations. I mean, each recommendation, it's not just the recommendation, it's a 6-page document that you have to fill out of what is the problem, how are you going to address it, what experts did you talk to, what are the unintended consequences, what is this going to cost? And so each one of the 50 recommendations really has been thought through from a lot of different angles. So I'm hopeful that maybe we can actually implement some of these changes, but in my conversations that I've had with jurisdictions, it's going to have to come from the state. A lot of cities, when we've talked to them in our meetings, they really don't feel that they've been a major barrier to housing. And so we're really going to need that statewide leadership to help move some of these things forward. So I really wish, like I mentioned, that legislator said that my meetings were boring, and so he didn't come. But I really, it makes me sad because the context behind each one of these is really important, right? Like it's really easy to go, okay, well, cities say they're doing fine with plan review, so we don't really need to implement that recommendation. But that's one perspective, right? The context behind how we got to that recommendation is really important. So that's kind of been something I wish the legislators, the ones that are on the housing, the housing, can't remember what they're called, boards, the committees, the housing committees. Yes, thank you. Because they're on the HPAC too, right? So the senators and the representatives who are the heads of those housing committees are also on HPAC. They could have come, and I hope that they'll really dig into the context of it, because I think it is really important. So, I mean, as a business community, you all know that it's important that we have homes for people to live in, that work for us, and also that help feed our businesses. I mean, I know we feel that at Multitech too. So hopefully we'll get some progress forward, but yeah. Thank you.
Thank you. Let's do a little applause for Natalie this morning. Thank you. From the light outside, there's coffee. We got the energy going, and I can cross off browbeat the audience from my agenda. And we do have time for Q&A with Natalie, but we're going to do it together with her and Jodi after we get Jodi up here. So I think most people in the room know Jodi Hack, many as Representative Hack from South Salem. So we appreciate you being here. We're really happy to have her back as the CEO of the State Association Home Builders. And she's gonna keep the conversation going around home building, and then we'll do a Q&A with both of you afterwards.
Right. Yes, good morning. Lots of familiar faces in here. Nice to see everybody. Great to be back in this environment, just in a different way. So heard a lot of interesting things around housing. I thought I'd give you a little bit of perspective on the political side of what's about to happen and kind of a little bit about what did happen. A lot of you probably heard about House Bill 3414, which was the governor's housing bill that made it all the way through the session, had multiple, well, our part of it, had multiple lives throughout the session, and then ended up failing by one vote on the very last day. So I thought maybe I'd give you a little bit of perspective on what was in that piece of legislation and what we expect to see moving forward in the short session. So House Bill 3414 actually had probably the most contentious component of that was the expansion of UGB, which was going to allow us to have a one-time expansion of up to 150 acres in places, cities that had an urban reserve or non-resource land. So it wasn't all cities across the state, but those that we had identified that could use some additional land. What we hear from our members, which is nearly 3,000 builders and developers and contractors across the state, Natalie and her company being one of them, is that we need land and process issue. So in order to address some of those issues, and you also heard Matt say from the governor's office, we need to build affordable housing. We don't disagree with that, but we've got to have some affordable land to be able to do that. And then we hear from Thousand Friends and League of Conservation Voters and OCN and all of those folks that all we want you to do is build within. Well, we've tried that. We've built up as much as we can. We've done all those things. And we're not going to say that there isn't land within the UGB that we also need to work on. But we've got some constraints that I think Natalie and the HPAC have tried to identify within the UGB that also needs to be addressed over time. We passed House Bill 2001 during the session that addressed some of our goals in our land use system that need some work. So they're going to do the Oregon Housing Needs Analysis. That work is going to take years to do, and that's working with local jurisdictions to identify the housing needs across our state. But in the meantime, we have to build houses. We're 140,000 units short, and every single month we go farther and farther behind. We built fewer houses last month than we did a year ago the same time. We're also, as you heard Matt say earlier, we are in unprecedented economic and inflation and interest rate times that we've seen the worst in decades. So not only are we facing a housing crisis, but we're facing an economic, inflationary, and interest rate crisis as well, which adds another layer to the political realm that we didn't even have last session fully, that we're going to have this session. So that being said, within House Bill 3414, we expanded, along with the governor's office, the ability for builders to utilize variances and adjustments. So Natalie could explain this probably in much more detail than I can, but broad sweep, if there was an ability for a builder to say build a triplex versus a single family home because they needed a different setback, let's say. Code called for 20 feet, and if they could get 10 feet, they could build a larger unit. We said, let us have that variance or that adjustment so that we can build what the zone already requires us to build, or different variances like that. Let us move where we place the garage door because we can build differently. We might be able to build a triplex if we can move garage doors. Different things like that. I'm simplifying it. It can be very complicated, but that's what we were shooting for. We started out with a very broad use of variances and adjustments. The cities didn't like that. That became very contentious. So where that ended up was more of an inverted process to say that these are the variances we will allow you to use instead of these are the ones that you can't use. We had it very broad and said these are only the pieces that you can't use, and we'll let you have basically many more options. So that was okay. We still felt like we could still make some headway in the variances and the adjustments. So we worked through that process. In addition to that, we addressed some issues around frivolous appeals that happen. I'm sure you all have heard about NIMBYism and the appeals that our builders and developers go through all the time. It's one thing to get a piece of property. It's another thing to actually be able to develop and build on it. That can be years and years and years in the process of appeal after appeal after appeal. So we were able to address some of those concerns. In addition to that, it established the Housing Accountability and Production Office, calling it the HAPO. Oddly enough, the state of California has a HAPO, and my counterpart in California came and testified. When they actually stood that office up and fully funded it with the right lawyers and staff, it actually worked, and it provided a landing place in the state of Oregon for cities who actually wanted to build opportunities to build that they hadn't had before. What that did is it established a place for developers and builders to come when they had an issue with a local jurisdiction where the jurisdiction may be interpreting statute incorrectly or being some sort of obstructionist in development. And maybe they thought they were following the rules correctly, but just interpreting them incorrectly, or there was miscommunication. Things were not going well. It's a place where they can go to try to work through their differences. If the local jurisdiction is just not working with the developers and is not getting it, this office can step in and say, look, we're going to hold you accountable and you're going to do this differently. We're going to try to work it out first, but if you don't, we're going to step in. Establish the HAPO. In addition to that, again, we expanded the UGB, that one-time expansion. Some cities it was 150 acres, others it was 75 acres. I think that was about, did I miss anything, Natalie, in that?
That was the highlights.
Within the, I will say within the expansion of the urban growth boundary, you heard Matt talk a lot about the need for affordable housing. We recognize that. And within the expansion of the 150 or the 75 acres, we said, okay, we agree with that. So in an attempt to also keep the price of land down and be able to build those affordable homes, we said we will agree that 30% of whatever is in those projects will be affordable. That was up to the developer and the local jurisdiction to sit down. So let's say it was Salem. The developer would sit down with the city of Salem and say, okay, what need do you have? Is it workforce housing or is it apartments? Whatever the greater need is, they would work between them to decide of that 30%, is the whole 30% going to be workforce housing or first time homebuyer housing? And what that meant is it couldn't be over 130% AMI. If it's apartments and you needed transitional apartment type housing, it couldn't be over 80% AMI. So the affordability piece was in there. We had some concern around whether or not, expressed from some legislators, whether or not the affordable housing piece would actually be built, and they wanted our builders to step up and say that they would take some accountability around that. So again, we stepped up to the plate, said, okay, we offered to hold back 15% of the market rate housing until the affordable housing component started, which you all are in business. You understand profits most of the time come at the end of the project. Well, same with them. So they were willing to hold back their profit until the end of that and said, we'll make sure that the affordable housing pieces are built. That was not good enough. That was one of the most contentious pieces at the end days, or one of the reasons why several said that they voted no. That one, we were blowing up our land use system, and two, they didn't believe us that the affordable homes would be built. So fast forward now, we've had an interim. I wouldn't say we've really had an interim because this has continued to be such a hot topic. And as you heard from Natalie, that work has continued, and clearly we are not moving ourselves out of the housing crisis. And until we address these issues and until we can get some legislation like this across the finish line, we are not going to. So the conversation that we're having now around all the politics and trying to figure out how you thread the needle between the environmental side and the home building side is, in 3 years from now, if you don't do something, 2 years from now, we're going to be having the same conversation. Because the more scripted they get and the more difficult they make it on our builders, we're just not going to be able to build. And it isn't that we don't want to, it's that we can't afford to. We were already deed restricting and doing everything that we could in 3414 originally. What they're trying to bring back right now, and part of my conversation back and forth with Matt and with the governor's office, is the more you script that, it's not just up to us, it's up to the banks to decide to what we can and can't do. And they've now increased the density to a point that it may not pencil for us. They now want to penalize us if we don't build affordable houses. So they want to deed restrict and take back land from the developer. So they want to say that if you now don't build or don't give us more guarantee around the affordable housing side, we want to take the land back at a discounted price. Well, there isn't a lender out there that's going to lend on land that they can't value at what they need to be able to make the project pencil. So politics in it are tough because I don't think that the environmental groups are ever going to get there around the land use piece. And so these are going to be tough votes regardless. And as I said earlier, we lost by 1 vote. We vote counted the heck out of that. We had our votes. And it wouldn't have mattered, I don't think, what we would have done. They would have flipped one. And so until they decide that getting people off of our streets and into shelters and out of shelters and into homes is a priority, I don't know what more we're going to be able to do. And so our message isn't around, we're not here to blow up the land use system. We respect the land use system, but it is not working for us anymore. We have to think outside the box. And we have an urban reserve within our land use system for a reason. And this is the reason we have it. We're being respectful of it. We're not asking for huge amounts of land. Less than 1% of our land right now across the state of Oregon is in housing. So even our governor has said that she's not interested in building more shelters. We've talked to folks who are running shelters. They have to have transitional housing for people to get out of shelters or they're back on the street. So we need all types of housing or we're going to continue to perpetuate poverty. We've got to get people out of shelters into apartments, from apartments into housing if we're ever going to have generational wealth that they talk so greatly about. So we're committed and dedicated to that. We're going to continue to fight this fight. But this is going to be one heck of a lift this session again. So we're prepared and we'll be battling it out. I think this time around, we've got a few more friends than we did the last session. The affordable housing folks are joining hands with us, partnering with us. A lot of the cities, surprisingly enough, in the end, the League of Oregon Cities came alongside us, as well as several of just local cities just joining forces with us. So we're going to stick together, but we have our work cut out for us. So there's a lot of changes, movements, and leadership in the Capitol. The speaker, I'm sure most of you know, is going to run for AG. We've got Ways and Means Chair, running for Treasurer. So we have a new leader on the House side who was our Vice Chair in Housing. So a lot of moving parts on the political front that are going to be challenging as well. So I'm 35 days to get it done. Any questions? I think I have about 2 minutes.
Well, we actually have about 10 minutes for both of you. So
Okay, perfect.
You're welcome to take it from the panel here if you'd like, because the question
Okay.
answer times for both of you. Anybody have any questions for either of these two? Sure we do. It's a lot there.
Salem, that we get 150 acres or 75, is that enough? Is that a one-time deal, once every year?
So it's one time in 10 years. That's the thing. It's so modest. And Salem, I think Kaiser definitely would have gotten it. You know, when we started out, we thought everybody across the state should have the opportunity. And they beat it up so much that we ended up dwindling it down, that those who had urban reserves, there were 14 cities and Metro. And then Metro beat it down so that Metro barely got any of it. And then we opened it up to those with non-resource lands. I don't know, I'd have to go back and look to see if Salem actually fit in it, but I know a lot of the outskirt areas did. So your feeders for sure.
Well, and one aspect of it too was the applicant and the city had to be willing.
Yeah. But it's a start, which affects our entire state. You know, I mean, And we want to be able to show that this actually, and I think that's the other reason why I know it is. They're so fearful of this is because they know that if we do this, it's going to show that it works because we can build affordable. Because the problem is the land within the UGB one, often what's left is wetlands, or it's a cliff, or they've made it so difficult to build on it that we can't, or it's so expensive that we can't build affordable. It's full of trees and they charge, you know, anywhere from $20,000 to $60,000 a tree to take down. The land sitting right next to the UGB, and that was the other part of this. It had to be adjacent. It couldn't be farmland in the middle of the country, which was another narrative that was set. It had to be next to. So you've got land sitting next to, especially with the affordability piece to it, the market's only fair that's going to bear, and they're only going to be able to sell it for what it can be sold for, right? So it keeps the affordability piece in check. That land's going to sell far less than what you've already got in the UGB that's got, you know, infrastructure right there, which yes, you're going to hear, well, you still have to pay for infrastructure. Yeah, we do. And there were components in that, and there will be in this next bill addressing some of the infrastructure.
Is that next to, I'm sorry, is that next to the property line, or could you go like, for example, east of Corn River?
It has to be like contiguous, but a street is contiguous. Yeah.
And we are addressing your unincorporated areas for middle housing too. I'm gonna put that, I just got that stuck in a bill for Salem.
One thing I didn't hear today from Matthew or anyone is any kind of communication or coordination on the federal side, like HUD requirements. I know that with affordable, there's that component too, like tax credits and whatnot. Is there any conversations happening?
So as far as like the ARPA funds and all those connections,
Yes.
I wouldn't say, so those aren't included in the legislation, but I know in some of our previous developments similar to this on the affordability side, the affordable housing providers are definitely connected with those and are making all of those, like some of our projects we have right now are utilizing the ARPA funds and that sort of thing. I think a lot of them in order to build the affordable have to. The state's going to step in and try to backfill some of that because they're finding even with those, it's getting harder and harder. I think there's been some disconnect though between the state agency and the backlog of the $1 billion. This is probably ringing some bells. In making those connections, I don't know all that, but yeah, I think they're trying, but there's a lot. I wouldn't say it's the best.
From the HPAC perspective, we've been focused on the things that are within the control of the state. So we haven't been having conversations about federal requirements.
Quick question. This is your opinion. I have my own opinion, but I know your opinion. When you look at the comments that we hear all the time about economic stability and what the future looks like for Oregon, one thing that our country's always been drinking on is that home ownership piece and stability long term would be getting to the point that we don't have a rent. You know, Oregon continues to slide as far as where we rank in all 50 states. We're now top 10 of the worst home ownership, percentages in the nation. What's your opinion? Why do we continue to slide?
You want to go into it?
I think, from a development perspective, it's expensive, right? I mean, you can't have home builders can't build currently a $200,000 house because the lot costs $150,000+. So I think that is a big part of it. I mean, I know I've heard, comparisons about interest rates now versus the 80s, and obviously it's less, but the price of a home was way less too. So from a purely economical part of it, the amount of money that goes into the land before you even get the house on it is so high right now. Well, by the time we talk about, and they're just making it, all these requirements just make it worse, right? All the stormwater we have to have, the offsite traffic stuff we have to have, when we save trees, the parks SDCs, I mean, all these things, which are not bad things, but the land, the infrastructure that goes into the land is so high.
Almost makes it, on this side of, the private sector, almost appears like not directing people to home ownership, we'd rather, it's lifelong, rental state.
There are several legislators that believe that. There are many that believe that we should put people in boxes, in apartments, and this is how it should be. Not all of them feel like people should have home ownership. I think also when you compare us to other states, we charge so much in fees that it's comparatively, we're behind before we ever start. But, I think we talk the good talk that we want to promote home ownership, but when the rubber meets the road, we're not passing legislation that says that. We're not doing the things that get us in that direction. We're taking ourselves in the opposite direction. We're not pro-business. And building homes is a business. And yeah, we do have affordable home builders that are out there trying to do that work. But at the end of the day, we need builders. The state's not in the business, shouldn't be in the business of building homes.
Well, because you're viewed as being bad if you're a home builder, right? You're evil, you're out for money. And I think there's this idea that home builders shouldn't make money, that they're greedy, but we don't ask any other profession to do it for free, So there needs to be kind of this change in narrative between this, it's an adversarial type system right now, and we need to change that and recognize that housing is a public good and that we need to be working together, and that home builders aren't these greedy, money grubbing people. They're trying to have a livelihood just like everybody else.
And I asked the governor that question. I recently did an interview with her and asked, how do we change that from the top down? Because it literally is happening everywhere. It's that perception, and it's from the county commissioner to the planner to the permit tech. And oftentimes in their defense, I think that they think that they're just following the rules, but oftentimes it's looking for a rule to make it more difficult versus how do I help you with your development project? Instead, it's, well, this rule, we just had one in the city of Eugene. Guy goes in, he does his development, he's got 10 lots. He could build out 10 multifamily duplexes, triplexes. They literally tell him, you can apply for the 10 plots, but you can't apply for your permits on each one of those. You can only do one a year because they interpreted the rule that way. And we said, well, wait a minute. You literally plucked this one word out of these 2 sections of law and interpreted it that way. And we literally said to them, you realize that you're telling this developer that he can't build these, it's going to take him 10 years and he has to literally pay for this and sit on this land and do one at a time for 10 years. You know what they said to us? Yes. This was yesterday in our office. And I said, okay, so there's no, like, you're not willing to have any further conversation. They said, no, and if you don't like what we have to say, you can go to our Public Utilities Commission. And we said, okay.
Well, the amount
It's
of
stuff like that.
Yeah.
And they believe in their mind, this guy is like, I am following the rules.
Well, but I think it's nice that you're giving them the benefit of the doubt that you think they're following the rules. Number of times that I have been told, we think you're trying to get out of doing something. I have been told that so many times.
Are you going to the Public Utilities Commission with that one?
Oh, yeah.
Okay, good, thank you.
We're gonna go farther than that. Oh, yeah, this is gonna go much farther than that. Yeah. But then, they have to hire lawyers though, and they have to fight back, which costs money, which then gets passed on, then goes back to how do you afford to build? It's just a layer after layer. So you could go on and on. That's just a very small example of what they deal with every single day. And oftentimes they just walk away. They'll just put their hands up and walk away from a project and say, I just can't do it. I don't have the bandwidth. I don't have the money. I don't have the time. I have to be out building homes. I can't be in dealing with this. And this was 2 weeks that it took us over 2 weeks to just get the answer that we did get, which was that. But then
Well, I don't want to call for a round of applause after that, but I think we should go to any. So we have about 17 minutes left here, and we're going to use that time to shift directions a little bit. We have Trevor Leahy here. Trevor's a small business ombudsman with the Oregon Secretary of State's office, and he's going to tell us about this beneficial ownership information program. Before he comes up here, I will say this is so we don't always love to hear about new reporting programs for small businesses. We want to tell you all about it. Trevor is here to help us understand it, but this is a federal program. This was not Trevor's idea. So we really appreciate you coming here to help us understand what's going on and get us through this.
Thank you. Good morning, everyone. Thank you to the Salem Area Chamber for having me today. Hello, online friends. Nice to see you. I'm going to tell you a little bit about myself and my office, and then I'll tell you that the sky is falling, and then I'll tell you that the sky is not falling. So I do work for the Oregon Secretary of State's office. I manage the Office of Small Business Assistance. I've been with the Office of Small Business Assistance for 6.5 years. If you wonder what's the Office of Small Business Assistance do, we help small businesses, which for us is a for-profit or nonprofit company with 100 or fewer employees, navigate government. My role as small business ombudsman means that I am the complaint department for small businesses having issues communicating with, interacting with, or dealing with state and local government agencies. That probably sounds terrible, and sometimes it is, but a lot of times it's awesome. It's always interesting, and we never know who's on the other side of the phone. And I want to share that I do love this job because the person that hired me into the office is in the room, and it's important that they know that I love what I do. So I am the messenger here today about the Corporate Transparency Act, which is a federal program. It's already been voted through, so there's no advocacy needed here. It passed through Congress in 2021, and it takes effect January 1st of 2024. It is going to be a requirement for many businesses. Essentially going to be a registration at the federal level, totally unaffiliated with the Secretary of State, unaffiliated with the IRS. The Small Business Administration has nothing to do with it. This comes from the U.S. Department of Treasury and their Financial Crimes Enforcement Network, which heretofore I will refer to as FinCEN, because the Financial Crimes Enforcement Network is even longer than the Office of Small Business Assistance. So the reason this is happening is this is the Department of Treasury's attempt to combat money laundering and shell corporations. They're going to require businesses to report beneficial ownership information. So who owns what portion of a business to them. It is a free report. I'm spoiling why the sky is not falling. So it doesn't cost anything. And it is potentially a one-time report. But the penalties that they have written into this act are steep. So starting January 1st, no earlier, existing businesses have the full calendar year to register with FinCEN. New businesses established on or after January 1st have 30 days to register. Anyone, whether you're in existence prior to January 1st or after, making changes to ownership, has 30 days to report that to FinCEN. The penalties are $500 per day for non-compliance, up to $10,000 and 2 years in prison. There is not currently a reporting mechanism in place. There is not currently an enforcement program in place. And we don't have the answers at the Secretary of State. FinCEN has spoken to many different states and said, we are relying on you to get this message out. So that's why you don't see anyone from FinCEN in the room. I've never seen FinCEN in Oregon. They're relying on us. So that's why the sky is falling. The sky is not falling because it's a free report. If you never make changes to your ownership, it's a one-time thing. It'll be okay. What we need to do and what we're really focusing on is getting the word out to anyone who is at this point planning to start a business. Because they're going to have potentially until January 31st, if they register after January, to get the word out. That means it's a very narrow window for the Secretary of State to say, hey, new businesses, here's a thing that's happening. Anyone in this room who finds that they have to do this report, you've got the full year. And boy, I'll bet you that system breaks January 1st when everyone tries to register at the same time. So one of the other reasons the sky is not falling, there are 23 different exemptions written into the act. And I'll tell you, I don't know all of them. A few of my exemptions, though, are sole proprietors. Sole proprietors do not have to register. Nonprofits do not have to register. So the Salem Chamber. Large companies do not have to register. No comment.
What's the definition?
I will tell you that I can't recite the exact definition of large. To my recollection, it is different than the standard federal definition of large company because the standard is 500 employees plus a certain number of millions of dollars of revenue. This, if I recall, has a lower number of employees in that threshold. I want to say it's 250. If anyone knows, I'm thrilled that you've already done this much research. But it's a federal requirement involving number of employees and amount of revenue for your business. And then there are several exemptions for securities brokers, which I think is fascinating. What we want people to do is know about this, talk about this, spread the word to the small business communities that you all work with. If there's a general contractor in the room, you probably work with subcontractors. Tell them about it. It's going to be a private, I'm sorry, I'm trying to use the word private. It's a non-publicized database. So no one in the room is ever going to know if someone's in compliance or not. None of us will ever know if someone is outside compliance until those of us who work with small businesses start hearing about penalty letters and non-compliance letters. So the Secretary of State does have a little bit of a plan to get the word out. First of all, I've already been wandering the state talking about this in rooms like this. Thanks again for having me. We've done a modest email campaign involving me sending emails to chambers of commerce, small business development centers, partner agencies, the Employment Department, Department of Revenue, Business Oregon, the ones we work with the most. We make sure that they know about it. Department of Consumer and Business Services, their division of financial regulation is all over this. They know about it and they're working with financial institutions and insurance companies. That's what I'm doing personally. Like I sit down and I send a new email to another group once or twice a week. If you want me to send that email to you, I will. The Secretary of State launched a web page about this yesterday. It's on our website. We don't want people to go to that website. We want people to go to the FinCEN website because FinCEN has the answers. All we can do at the Secretary of State is say, please go to the FinCEN website. Then in December 11th, we are going to do a massive email blast. If the Secretary of State Corporation Division has your email address, you're going to get an email from us. we have 86% of all registered businesses' email addresses. And we're gonna send that out saying, hey, guess what, everyone? And then we will continue promoting it after that. But the message we want to get out is it's happening. Please go to the FinCEN website, which is fincen.gov/BOI. I love it because it's fincen.gov/board. I feel like I usually have something else to pepper in there, but I'm happy to answer as many questions as I can about the Ruth.
So you said, sole proprietorships are exempted, but is that ABN number?
LLCs are specifically called out as needing to report.
So a single member LLC has to.
As far as I know, yes, but I would encourage any single member LLC to go to the FinCEN website and find out if they fall under one of the exemptions. FinCEN, FINCEN.gov/BOI. Oh, and I have little flyers that FinCEN graciously sent me in electronic format, not formatted for printing, that I have messed with and print at a Rico in batches of 100 at a time, because they also didn't give us any money to advertise this.
That's my question, and I don't want you to even answer this, is what would be the trigger for an enforcement action under this registration?
We have no idea.
And that's kind of what I figured. So I'm a nerd. My job has been distracted. I've been watching since 2021. I can tell you, I don't think the exemption for most businesses is going to be, and I looked at this yesterday, and now I went back, as you said, 200. I read 20 employees, 5 million in revenues, and then there's brick and mortar requirements that you have an office in the state. But what that does is that means it captures the bulk of our membership.
Yeah.
Right? The folks that have 5 employees and they're doing 1.2 million, right? That's every small business. And so it's really important that we figure out, one, how to get those folks into the program, and two, what's going to be the enforcement trigger for non-compliance, because there is going to be a lot of non-compliance.
Yes.
Pure ignorance.
Yes. I'll tell you that about 2 or 3 months ago, I signed up for updates from FinCEN. And I think I've gotten 3 or 4 emails since then. They're engaging in rulemaking about grace periods, which is wonderful. But honestly, you're right. We don't know how to reach everyone and tell everyone about this. And you said you thought it might be 20. I could be wrong. I could have read 20 and thought that's a really low number for a federal threshold. And my brain added a 0 to make it 200 because that's more federally.
Yeah,
But we want everyone who thinks, oh my God, is this a thing I have to do, to go to the FinCEN website and learn about it.
The legal reason why there can be dual registration is like that. Just say it automatically sign.
Not that I know of.
It'd be a lot easier for them to get all the data quickly because it's already embedded in the state system, and once again, we create a much more liability for us as business team, and then have
I kind of agree with you. I guess one of the things is Oregon not every business has to register in Oregon. So if someone's operating under their real and true name, Trevor R. Leahy Dentistry, I'd probably be a sole proprietor under that, but I wouldn't have to register. But then if I had a partnership or found out that I didn't qualify for an exemption, there's no way for that to be communicated at the federal level. And it's because there's different definitions between the state.
a whole bunch of responses.
Yeah. Did I see a hand over?
If you really want to get the word out, just pick some poor bastards, go kick down his door with a bunch of FBI agents and from his office and get the word out.
Ooh.
Make it Hamilton insurance.
Yeah.
You know, I like to think that I'm a kinder, gentler team of government, so I try not to kick down any doors.
Principal.
So,
Lena, do we have a question from the online or is that more? of a comment?
No, that was just a comment from somebody in the city who said that she represents the federal funds for CDBG and home for the urban development department of the city of Salem. And the federal dollars have a lot of rules that also hinder housing development available at the resources.
Perfect. Well, let's
Thank
do one
you.
more round of applause. Thank you. I want to note before we go here that we've never had a group that has all stopped on the exact minute that they're supposed to stop without any level of controlling. You guys are the best. Thank you. Thank you guys for being here and we'll see you all again